The sky had not cried so earnestly in weeks. The rain fell in lashing veils, washing the moors clean of spring's pale hesitations. Grass gleamed slick and heavy with the weight of it, and the stone walls lining the road to Hawthorne Hall bled moss and memory in equal measure. Eleanor was soaked to the skin by the time she reached the stables. Her boots were sodden, skirts clinging indecently to her legs, hair a wild tangle beneath the bonnet now more symbolic than practical. But none of it mattered, not when she saw him, standing as if carved from the stone arch behind him, the storm bowing around his shoulders like a creature cowed by the greater force of his will. Captain James Harrow had returned. It was not possible, and yet there he was. 6 months of silence, of imagining him dead beneath foreign stars, or worse, wed to some perfumed siren in a Madeira port. And now he stood before her as though summoned by the ache in her chest alone. He looked older somehow, not in years, but in gravity. The angles of his face were cut sharper, shadows deeper. His uniform was soaked through, coat undone, shirt open at the throat, revealing a sliver of scarred skin that hadn't been there before, a talisman of all he would never say. She could not speak, her breath tangled somewhere between her throat and ribs, fluttering like a trapped bird. Her heart, always a traitor in his presence, beat a reckless tattoo. "I had no intention of coming back," he said at last, voice rasped raw as weathered rope. The words were meant to distance, but they landed like a confession. Her mouth opened to reply, but only silence emerged. What could she say? That she had not slept soundly since the last time they spoke? That his absence had carved hollows beneath her eyes no powder could hide? He stepped forward, water trickling from the brim of his hat. He reached up and swept it off, letting the rain touch his face. She noticed then, his hand trembled slightly, fingers calloused and stained with ink or blood or both. He looked at her as if there was something fragile, something holy, and entirely beyond his reach. Still he reached. His palm, rough and warm despite the chill, brushed her cheek with aching tenderness. She turned her face into it without thought, closing her eyes as if by doing so she might hold the moment still. "You cut your hair," he murmured. "You never replied to my letter," she whispered back. The words hung between them like smoke, visible, inevitable, inescapable. "I read it," he said after a pause. So many times the ink blurred. She opened her eyes. "Then why didn't you—" "Because I wanted to stay gone." His voice was hoarse, almost cruel in its restraint. "Because if I came back, I knew I would do this." And then he kissed her. It was not soft. It was not sweet. It was every damn thing they'd ever withheld. Every near touch, every breathless look, every almost. His mouth was hot and hungry, devouring the months between them with bruising urgency. Eleanor gasped against him, and he swallowed the sound, pressing her back against the stable wall, rain forgotten, proprietary drowned in the torrent of want. He tasted of rain and rum and desperation. She clutched at his coat, fingers sliding over soaked wool and leather, seeking something solid in the maelstrom of sensation. He groaned, low and guttural, as her hands tightened in the collar of his shirt, dragging him closer. There was no space left between them, not in breath, not in thought, and yet it was not enough. His mouth broke from hers with a shuddered breath, lips grazing her cheek, her temple, her jaw, as though he could not decide where to land. She stood trembling beneath his touch, not from cold, though she was soaked through, but from the slow, searing ache that unfurled beneath her skin. Desire, yes, but also something older, more dangerous. Longing tempered by the blade of restraint. James's hands, broad and battle-worn, slid to her waist, reverent, trembling. "I've imagined this 1,000 times," he said, voice ragged, "and it never once came close to this." Eleanor looked up at him, the rain beating on his lashes. His hair darkened, curling at the ends. His uniform clung to him, sculpting the shape of him in soaked linen and wool. Her hand rose of its own accord, tracing the ridge of his collarbone where it met the curve of his throat. His pulse leapt beneath her fingers. She remembered that neck, that scent, the hollow just above his heart where her lips had once hovered, though they had never touched it. Not then. Not when he'd stood in her father's library asking for a book he'd never read, just to see her fingers turn its pages. Not when he'd caught her hand on the stairwell under the gaze of portraits too proud to speak. She'd never kissed him, not truly, until today. And yet it had always been there, suspended between them like a string drawn taut. Now the string had snapped. "I thought I could bury you," he murmured. The words a confession more than an apology. I drank to forget, fought to forget, prayed even. None of it worked. "You left me without a word," she said, not accusing, only acknowledging the wound that still pulsed beneath the scar. "I had to." He leaned his forehead to hers. "If I had stayed, Eleanor, I'd have ruined you." A half-smile ghosted her lips. "And what do you think you're doing now?" His breath caught, then released in something like a laugh, something like a sob. His thumb brushed her bottom lip as though weighing the cost of kissing her again. "Tell me to stop," he said, low and dark. She didn't. Instead, she slid her hands beneath his coat, curling her fingers around the damp linen at its back. He shuddered, every muscle in him tensed like a held breath. He kissed her again, slower this time, more deliberately, with a depth that cracked her open. She could feel it in the curl of his fingers around her waist, the drag of his mouth down the column of her neck, the quiet way he breathed her name between each kiss like a litany. "Eleanor," he murmured again. "Do you remember the orchard?" A sharp gasp escaped her. That wasn't real. It was the most real thing I've ever known. His lips found the edge of her jaw. "I watched you lying there in the tall grass with apple blossoms in your hair. I wanted to taste you then. I wanted to sin." "You did," she said, breath trembling. "No." His hand slid to the curve of her hip. "But I'm going to." The door to the stable creaked open beneath James's hand, heavy on rusted hinges. Inside, the scent of damp hay and warm horseflesh mingled with the sharp tang of wet leather. A single lantern burned near the tack wall, casting flickering light over oiled saddles and the sheen of rain on both their clothes. Eleanor stepped in first, the hem of her dress dragging rivulets across the stone floor. James followed, shutting the door behind them with the slow gravity of a man sealing his fate. He stood still, watching her. She turned to face him fully, water dripping from her sleeves, her bodice clinging scandalously to the shape of her. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, as if her ribs could no longer contain the heart hammering beneath. He moved toward her, each step deliberate. When he reached her, he lifted one hand, just one, and touched her chin. Tipped it up, studied her as though he meant to memorize her now, not in silence, but in substance. "You are not the same woman I left." "No," she whispered, "and you are not the man I remember." Something in his expression cracked open at that. He brought both hands to her face, cupping her cheeks with reverence, as though she were a thing too sacred to touch, and yet he could not stop. They kissed again, but this was no storm. It was a slow burn, a deep wound reopening. He slipped her cloak from her shoulders, fingers ghosting down her arms. The fabric fell to the straw-strewn floor with a whisper. His hands skimmed her waist, her hips, not hurried now, worshipful, as if the delay had taught him patience, and patience had taught him hunger. Eleanor let her hands move too, over his shoulders, across the firm expanse of his chest, down to the edge of his belt. She was not bold, but she was no longer afraid. His name left her lips like a prayer as she pressed her body to his, and he groaned against her mouth in answer. They moved backward blindly, stumbling into the dark corner of the stable where an empty stall yawned open like a sanctuary. James turned them so she stood before the gate, his breath warming the hollow of her neck. His voice was low, uneven. "If you tell me to stop, I'll go. I swear it." She looked up at him, rain still caught in the ends of her lashes, defiant tears clinging where they did not fall. "Don't go," she said. His mouth met hers again, not with hunger this time, but with need, with the slow, aching pressure of years collapsed into a moment. He began to unlace the back of her dress, fingers fumbling only slightly. The bodice yielded like a secret, and he pulled it down gently, baring her shoulders to the warm air of the stable. Her skin pebbled beneath his touch, and he bent to kiss the place where her neck met her collarbone. She gasped, not from surprise, but from recognition. He was careful. Every inch of her exposed was met with his palm, his mouth, as if it were unwrapping something priceless, and half afraid of breaking it. And she, for her part, trembled beneath him, not from fear, but from how deeply seen she felt. Every look, every sigh, every slow pass of his lips felt like a vow. They sank together into the bed of hay within the stall, the world outside forgotten. The storm had not stopped, but it was no longer loud. All sound now came from them, breath and whisper, gasp and moan, the wet rustle of cloth, the murmur of his voice at her ear, calling her name as if they were only he'd ever learned. The wet rustle of cloth, the murmur of his voice at her ear, calling her name as if it were the only one he'd ever learned. Their bodies moved together with a slow inevitability, not frantic, not rushed, but with the reverence of something long dreamed and finally real. Her fingers curled into his shirt as he leaned over her, their foreheads pressed close, breath mingling. His touch traced the line of her ribs, the hollow of her waist, memorizing, worshipping. And when he joined her fully, it was not just a merging of bodies, but of time and ache and all that had once been refused. She did not cry out. She gasped, yes, clutched him, moved with him, but the moment was too full for sound. It was quiet, that joining, intimate in the way of sacred things. They were both shaking by the end, he from restraint, she from surrender. And when it was over, when he lay half curled around her, breath ragged and hand tangled in her hair, she heard him whisper something into the curve of her neck. "Tell me I haven't drunk this." She turned to face him fully, her fingers against his jaw, rough with stubble. "No, James," she said. "This is real. It always was." The rain had quieted to a hush against the roof, a soft tapping like the memory of the storm that had passed. In the stall, the air had warmed with the weight of her breath and the tangle of their limbs. Lantern light flickered low on the wall, catching the rise and fall of bare shoulders beneath the folds of his coat now wrapped around them both. Eleanor lay curled against James's chest, her head tucked beneath his chin. She listened to the sound of his heartbeat, steady now, though she had felt it thundering against her ribs not half an hour ago. Neither of them had spoken since their breathing had calmed. Words, for all their weight, seemed too thin for the thing that had passed between them. His fingers traced slow circles against her back, idle and reverent. "I thought I'd forgotten how this would feel," he said at last, voice rough and low. "Not the pleasure, but the being with you. The way your breath stutters. The way you taste of wild things and defiance." She smiled faintly against his chest. "You never kissed me before today." "I know," he paused. "And yet I knew exactly how you'd taste." She reached up, brushing her fingers against his cheek. "And I knew how it would feel to have you fall apart in my hands. That surprised me less than it should have." He turned then, propping himself on one elbow so he could look at her. His expression held something raw, unguarded. "This can't stay here, can it? In this stall, in this moment?" "No," she said quietly, "but it also can't be undone." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but thoughtful, as though the air itself was heavy with consequence. "I'm not the girl you left behind," she added, lifting her gaze to his. "And I'm not the man who left." They stared at one another for a long time. In the distance, a horse nickered softly, shifting in its stall, as if even the animals could sense the change that hung in the air. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers. "I'll leave the Navy." Her brow lifted, but she said nothing. "I'll find something else, something dull and honest. I can't go back to the sea knowing what I'd leave behind again." Eleanor studied his face. His sincerity was almost painful to look at. "And what do you think I've been doing, James? Sitting in the orchard with blossoms in my hair, waiting to be claimed?" His jaw flexed. "No, I know better. I've changed. You'll find pieces of me missing, or sharper." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll cut myself if that's the cost." Her throat tightened at that. She reached for his face, pulled him down, kissed him, this time not from passion, but from certainty. When they finally rose, they did so slowly, not with haste, but with a kind of ceremony. They dressed without turning away from each other, as though the veil of modesty had already been lifted, and with it all pretense. He kissed her hand before they left the stall, and she let him. The door creaked open once again. The rain had nearly stopped. The sky was still gray, but the edge of the clouds glowed faintly gold, a suggestion of light, of something that might be dawn if one waited long enough. They walked back towards the house without speaking, their hands brushing once, then twice, before finally settling into each other as naturally as breath. Behind them, the stable door swung closed, and with it, the world as it had been before.